it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. So I came to Jerusalem, and was there 3 days. And I arose in the night, I and some few men with me. Neither told I any man what God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. And I went out by night, by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, into the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire. Then I went on to the gate of the fountain, and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass. Then went I up in the night by the brook, and viewed the wall, and turned back, and entered by the gate of the valley, and so returned. And the rulers knew not whither I went, or what I did. Neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work. Then said I unto them, Ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. And they said, Let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn, and despised us, and said, What is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king? Then answered I them, and said unto them, The God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build. But ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. So we'll get through the end of the chapter here today, and kind of getting a little more into the meat of what Nehemiah is doing once he gets to Jerusalem here. So we saw last week he asked the king for permission to go for materials to build the wall and all of that, and was granted that by the king. And we pick up this week in verse 9 there. It says, Then I came to the governors beyond the river. Verse 11 says, So I came to Jerusalem. So he's now in Jerusalem. He's made the journey from Susa to Jerusalem. But we're not really given any description of that journey. We're not really told anything about his travels, whether it was a good trip or difficult, or if he got a flat tire or anything like that. But we can assume that this probably took at least 2 months to get to Jerusalem. It probably would have taken a little longer than that, because if you remember, this trip had been made 2 other times, right? By Zerubbabel and then by Ezra in the book of Ezra, right? But Nehemiah did it a little different. He had what we might say a police escort or a military escort. I guess it's a little different than a police escort. A police escort gets you a little faster, but a military escort probably slows you down a little because there's more people traveling with you. So he had a military escort traveling with him, simply because his work was sanctioned by the king. The king was sending him as his representative. And of course, this doesn't mean that Nehemiah's faith was any less than Ezra's, that he thought he needed protection from the military. He still believed God could protect him, but he was, like I say, a representative of the king at this point. And it's similar to how we talked and said, hey, Nehemiah wants Jerusalem to look good because Jerusalem is a representation of God, right? It's God's city, and so you want it to look nice. And so similarly, the king of Persia wants Nehemiah to look nice because he's a representative of the king, right? And so he's going to send all his military forces with him and his banners flying and everything to make him look good. Not necessarily caring about what Nehemiah looks like, but caring about what himself looks like through Nehemiah. And so this would have been a pretty good caravan traveling there. And when it arrives in Jerusalem, it's going to attract some attention, right? It's not just one guy traveling by night and coming in. It's going to attract some attention, whether Nehemiah wants that or not. And so we see specifically mentioned in verse 10 here, two of what we'll see are the enemies of Nehemiah. We've got Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah, he's called Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite. And then if we add to that in verse 19, we have another one added to it. Now, I watched a YouTube video of this British guy trying to tell me how to pronounce this, and he said it's Geshem. I don't think it's Geshem. I'm going to go with Jeshem. I don't trust them British guys. So I'm calling him Jeshem. It's easier for me to say anyway. But we've got these three guys. These are going to be the three main enemies of Nehemiah throughout his story. And so we see here, hey, he's off to a good start, making a good first impression. He's already got three enemies, and we're not told of any friends there yet. So that was sarcasm, by the way. So let's look at these enemies for a minute here. We want to see who is up against Nehemiah. So the first one we've got here is this Sanballat. And again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly or not, but it's what it looks like to me. So you're getting the Cox pronunciation here, all right? So Sanballat here, he was he's going to be kind of the face of Nehemiah's enemy. He's kind of the leader, the chief enemy here, and he's got some kind of official position in Samaria over some branch of their military, and so he's a powerful feller. And he's not somebody that you really want working against you, but that's just how it's going here for Nehemiah so far. Then we've got this Tobiah. He's called the servant here in verse 10. I think we can take that to mean that he is under Sanballat here in some way or another. Now, he's not a Samaritan, but... So they're a different force here, but he's still in conjunction with Sanballat here. I think where we can see Sanballat as the military leader here, we can see Tobiah as kind of the intelligence of the operation here. So if we think of our government structure and our forces, right, we've got military like the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and all that. And then we've got things like the CIA and the NSA and things like that. I like them spy shows if anybody else does. They're fun. But so he's going to be the CIA, right? He's going to be the intelligence gathering force here. He had friends that were inside the city. He had cousins that were working on the wall with Nehemiah. And so, Sanballat, he looks all big and bad, right? He's got the military force. He's the one that's attacking them. But I think Nehemiah's going to find that Tobiah here is just as powerful and just as dangerous, specifically because he's got those people on the inside that are kind of giving away what Nehemiah's trying to do. And then we see this Geshem or Geshem mentioned in verse 19, and he plays more of a minor role. He's kind of a recruit, right? So he's kind of a underling that Sanballat and Tobiah recruited to add to their military force here. So just a little bit more on the enemies of Nehemiah here. We've been focusing on what motivated Nehemiah. And I thought this was very important. And actually, Warren Wiersbe in this study, he actually leaves this out. And I was very upset about that. I had to look into it some more. But I wanted to know why these guys don't like Nehemiah. He just showed up, right? And they're like, hey, we don't like you. We don't want you here. So why? What's motivating them to attack Nehemiah, to oppose him? And I found three good reasons. The first reason I deem simply bad blood and history, right? So Tobiah, let's look at him. He was an Ammonite. If you study throughout the Old Testament here, before and after the events of Nehemiah here, the Ammonites were never really friendly with the Israelite people. They weren't necessarily, I don't think they would call themselves sworn enemies, but they definitely weren't friends, and they did fight quite a bit. And so, this group has a history of conflict with the Israelites. And so Tobiah's got that against him. So what's Sanballat got against him in that manner? Well, if we look back just one book to the book of Ezra, when Zerubbabel and Ezra came to be rebuilding Jerusalem, Sanballat and the Samaritans, they offered help. They refused it, right? They said, no, this is God's work. We're God's people. We're going to work on it. Hey, that's right for them to do. I'm not saying that they did wrong there, but it offended the Samaritans. It offended Sanballat here. And so he's still mad about that. He's mad from when Ezra refused him there. And so these two groups at least have something against Nehemiah simply because of his heritage and his history. I think a second reason that they're against him here is because of the circumstances of his arrival, right? He came with the king's entourage. He came with the military forces and everything. And they're not as scared of the military force, right? Because I'm sure he didn't come with, like, the entire Persian military, right? He just came with maybe a few guys to represent, right? So they're not threatened by that. What they're threatened by is the authority of the king, right? Because he's coming with this group sent by the king. He's endorsed by the king. He's a representative of the king. And that means that, hey, he can do what he wants. He not only has the will to build the wall, he has the ability and the power and the backing to build the wall. So he's actually going to get something done unless they do something about it, right? And so they see that and they're threatened. Why would that threaten them? Why do they care if Jerusalem has a wall? They've been terrorizing the Israelites here. They've been ruling that area. They've been the dominant force in that area. And if Jerusalem builds a wall and it's endorsed by the king of Persia, then, hey, for one, it's going to be a more fortified city. Secondly, it's going to be protected by Persia as well, because the king's going to see that as kind of his little, what we might call colony or something like that. And so he's going to possibly protect the Israelite people. So I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that summarizes the entire motivation of these guys, right? Jealousy and greed. They want Jerusalem for their own, and somebody else has it, and somebody else is strengthening it. My third reason for them disliking Nehemiah is that he's the third group to come to Jerusalem recently. The city's growing. It's becoming more of a nation. It's becoming more of a force for them to reckon with there. And so it's going to become too large for him to threaten at some point. And so, yeah, I think it all comes down to greed or to jealousy here. They're wanting what they shouldn't have, right? So I just wanted to take a minute there and look at the enemies of Nehemiah here. I think it's important to understand their motivation as well as Nehemiah's. But we will see that Nehemiah prevails, right? Because he's got better backing, and I'm not talking about the king of Persia here. And so we want to focus more on Nehemiah throughout this study, of course. And so we see here, let's look at what he does when he arrives in Jerusalem. Verse 11 here. So he arrives in Jerusalem. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Well, what did he do during those 3 days? Anybody got any guesses? Not yet. Not yet. He does that in verse 12. He arose in the night. I think for those 3 days, he rested. He took him a little break, right? He's traveled. Yeah. He's traveled for, what we say, 2 months at least. And so I think, he's tired and he's needing a break. He wants to be at his best, right, when he's doing God's work. And so it's okay for him to rest a little bit. That's how I'm reading it anyway, is he was there 3 days and then he arose in the night. And so I think for those 3 days he rested. And so getting to your point there, he arose in the night to begin kind of surveying the land, surveying the work that needed to be done. And so this is kind of maybe a odd thing as well, right, how he's going about this work. God had a plan, right? God sent him with a plan. So why not just get to work, go get your lumber, go get your stones, go get whatever you need and start building the wall? Well, the people aren't going to follow him if he doesn't have reason for him to follow him, right? Moses was able to motivate the people by convincing the Pharaoh and performing signs and things like that. Nehemiah wasn't sent with any of that in his quiver there, so he was needing to convince the people by logic, and that was part of God's plan for Nehemiah here. He knew Nehemiah could do that. And so he's got to come up with evidence of why they need to be working on this wall. And so he just begins to survey. But notice he does it in the night here. And this is interesting to me, right? He doesn't want anybody knowing what he's planning, what he's doing. And at first you read this and you say, oh, he's hiding from Sanballat and Tobiah and all those enemies that we just mentioned. But if you look again, it says in verse 12 there, and I arose in the night, I and some few men with me, neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. So he's not told anybody. He's not told the enemies. He's not told there in verse 16. It says, the rulers knew not whither I went or what I did, neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor the priests, nor the nobles, nor the rulers, nor the rest that did the work. So even these people that he's going to recruit, he hasn't even told what he's doing. And so he's kind of doing this in secret, but again, he wants to make sure he's got everything together before he goes to the people and says, look, here's what we need to do, because their next question is going to be, how are we going to do it? What's the plan here? And so he's got to have that plan formulated. Now, again, God had a plan. God's plan was Nehemiah, right? Nehemiah is going to formulate, God doesn't send him blueprints for a wall, right? He's got to figure out what parts of the wall need the most focus and that kind of thing. And so I think he's here determined that the city is in disrepair, as his brother said. Not that he didn't trust his brother, but he did want to see for his own eyes here. And he can see something different when he looks at the wall, right? His brother comes to him in chapter 1 there, and he says, oh, Jerusalem, it's just pitiful. City's torn down, the walls are burned, everything's terrible. But what's Nehemiah see? Well, he sees the same thing. We can read verses 13 and 14 and 15 there, and see that, hey, the wall is not in good shape. But does Nehemiah stop there? No. We have verse 17 and 18 there, where he convinces the people, hey, we need to do something about it. We don't just need to accept it for what it is. He accepts the initial circumstances, but he doesn't accept that they can't be changed. And that's something that makes Nehemiah here a great ruler, is he is willing to put in the work and willing to see the finished product from the start here, right? He can see what it's meant to be. He can see the potential And so that's definitely a quality that's needed in a leader. And so up to this point, when he's been surveying the city, he's not told anyone about what he's doing, what he's planning, or anything like that. But remember, God didn't send Nehemiah to build the wall by himself. God didn't intend for Nehemiah to pick up every stone and every log and build the wall himself. He wanted him to recruit some help. And so we see this in verse 17 and 18. And this brings us to our third evidence of Nehemiah's faith. You say, where was 1 or 2? That was last week, okay? So last week we looked at, we said we were going to look at 3 evidences for Nehemiah's faith. The first 2, Nehemiah had the faith to wait on God, right? To wait on God's timing. He also had the faith to ask of the Pharaoh, or not the Pharaoh, I'm going back to Moses here, right? He had the faith to ask of the king permission to go and for materials and well above what the king should have offered him, right? And those things both took faith to do. So what's taking faith in this second half of the chapter? Well, I think we can see here that Nehemiah had the faith here to challenge others. He had the faith to ask of the Israelites, right? So not only the faith to ask of the king, but ask of the Israelites. Now, did this take a whole lot of faith? You might look at it and say, well, no, I mean, what's the worst that can happen? I'll tell you the worst that can happen, all right? The worst that can happen, he gets sent back to Persia for punishment by the king, or he gets turned over to Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem and all those fellers. What do you think they're going to do to him? They're not going to be very nice, right? So he took a risk here to ask these people. He took a risk believing that they were also followers of God and that they would respond appropriately with the same faith that he had, right? So we've got to credit the people of Jerusalem here as well. In the end of verse 18, they said, let us rise up and build. So they agreed to do this, right? And so we've got to credit their faith as well because, hey, this was a risk for them. When they start building this wall, guess what's going to happen? The enemy's going to come and they're going to attack them. And they're not going to have an easy time doing it. And so they've got to take a risk as well. But let's look at Nehemiah's request here, because I think we can see something similar here to what we saw when he asked of the king. Right? We said when he was asking of the king that God's hand was all in that request. God was moving the king. God was giving Nehemiah what he needed to say, what he needed as far as materials and requests. And here we see, I believe, God's hand in Nehemiah's request to the Israelites as well. So in verse 17 here, we see Nehemiah starts off his request by summarizing what the problem is. Right? He lays out the disrepair of the walls, the city wasted and the walls ruined. It says here, burned with fire. And so we see at the end of this verse, he even uses the same word that his brother used when his brother came and told him, right? This word reproach. Remember us talking about that? Now, I think if you don't remember the word reproach, right, it means kind of offensive or something like that. And so Nehemiah here, though, is using it in a different context, right? His brother was saying that the people were under reproach, meaning that the enemies around the city were attacking them and were opposing them and ridiculing them and mocking them and trying to run them off, basically. So what's Nehemiah mean here? He says that we be no more a reproach. He wants the people not to be a reproach anymore. Wait, I thought the Israelites were under reproach. How can they be the reproach? So he's talking about something different here, and I think he's talking about them being a reproach to God, right? This city being burned, this city being in ruin. Remember, we said this city is supposed to be representative of God. It's supposed to be a shining figure of God's glory on earth, and it's not. it's in disrepair here. And so he's saying because of the state of this city, it's a reproach against God. They're not adequately representing God, and so people are looking at that city, and they're not only mocking the Israelites, they're mocking God, right? And so he says, hey, I'm going to motivate you with a couple problems here. One problem, hey, your city looks trashy. Your walls are torn down. You're not secure. But, hey, here's the other motivator. You're not representing God well. And, we can take that to heart as well. Sometimes if our life isn't in order, if we're not living right, if we're not adequately representing God, we're a reproach to God if we say we're a Christian, right? If we say we're a Christian, then we go down to the bar and hang out on Monday night after we've been at church all day Sunday, right? And so we need to be careful of that, be careful of how we're representing God, and make sure we're doing it in a way that he would be proud to look at us and claim us, right? And so I think that's probably the bigger motivator, not necessarily the security of the walls or anything like that, but definitely for Nehemiah, I believe this is the bigger motivator, is an adequate representation of God. I also wanted to point out here in his request, he's again not singling out the Israelites. He's not singling out the people of Jerusalem. He's not saying, so that you're no longer a reproach. He's saying so that we're no longer a reproach. He's including himself in that. He is one of these people, whether he has been living there or not. And so he's enlightened them to the problem here in verse 17. And not just that, but he's telling them that they can fix it, right, in verse 18 here. And so the solution is to rebuild the wall here. But he has one more thing that's very important to convince the people here before he gets to that request. He says in verse 18, "Then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me." And so here he's telling the people about God's protection. God's will is for them to rebuild the wall. If it was just Nehemiah coming to rebuild the wall and coming to recruit people, they may say, well, this is an impossible task. We've tried it before. The enemies around us, they just won't let us get away with it. Back in Ezra, they tried to rebuild the wall. It didn't work. They got mocked and ridiculed and made to stop. But that wasn't the time that God had planned for the wall to be rebuilt. God had planned for Nehemiah to rebuild the wall here, to lead this rebuilding. And so Nehemiah is telling them, hey, God sent me. God has given his blessing to this project, and it's time to rebuild the wall. And so he's convincing them not to follow him, but to follow God. And he tells them about God's protection on his way, probably, and his protection in his interaction with the king, right, King Artaxerxes, and all of that kind of thing that has happened in Nehemiah's life where God has been there. And so I think Nehemiah sharing his faith with these people is an important part in his convincing them to rebuild the wall. If he hadn't, I don't think they would have been on board with it. I don't think the wall would have ever gotten built, because the people, if they had began building it and Nehemiah hadn't said that God had sent him, they would have just been building it for their own purposes. They would have just been building it for me, not for God, right? And so we see a good convincing argument here from Nehemiah, I believe. And like I say, we've got to give some credit to the people who agreed to build this wall, who agreed to take on the project, because they do so in the end of verse 18. And I think, another obstacle that they had to overcome is who Nehemiah was, right? This guy comes in, he's been there 3 days, and he starts wandering around at night like a weird guy, right, looking at the outside of the city. And he won't tell anybody what he's doing there. He's very secretive. And then all of a sudden he comes to the people, and he says, hey, let's build this wall. Let's do this. God sent me. They don't know him. They don't know Nehemiah. If they do know him, guess who they know him as? The king's cupbearer. They don't know him as one of their friends or compatriots or anything like that. They know him as an outsider. And so why are they going to follow him, right? But God sent Nehemiah for a reason. And God sent Nehemiah with the words to say to convince them. And, I think in this situation and in many of the situations that we face today as well, sometimes it just takes a fresh perspective, right? Sometimes it takes somebody looking at it from a different angle, going around surveying what's wrong and saying, hey, I can fix that. We can fix that. We can do that. And so, when we're doing things here at the church, for instance, and somebody new comes in or whatever and says, hey, I've not worked with this area before, but I see a couple things you could do wrong or you could do better. Should we turn and be like, you don't know what you're talking about. You ain't been here a month. No, we should accept that, right? And maybe try it out. Maybe see what's missing. Now, I'm not saying do any kind of heresy, of course, but if it's just maybe the structure of our program or something like that, like the name tags that we're using for Bible school. That's something new we've not tried before. We tried other methods of keeping track of kids, and it was not very easy, so hopefully this will be a little better, right? But it's worth a try, and so sometimes all it takes is a fresh perspective. Sometimes it just takes a new look at the matter. But Nehemiah, I think, is a great leader, a great motivator here. There's a quote in Warren Wiersbe's commentary. He doesn't attribute the quote to anybody, but he says that it's been said that leadership is the art of getting people to do what they ought to do because they want to do it. And so that may seem kind of simple, but at the same time, who really wants to work on a wall? Maybe masons, maybe some masons, but for the most part, people don't want to do something like that. But Nehemiah has the qualities of leadership that allows him to properly motivate people. So we see that he's got them on board, but then in verse 19. We get some opposition right off the bat here. It says as soon as they got started, they were ridiculed by Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem here. Now, ridicule doesn't seem that bad, right? It says that they were laughed at and they despised us and talk bad against them, right? That doesn't seem that bad, but it can be hurtful, right? It's an attack, but it's a weak attack, I believe. It's been called the weapon of those who have no other, is ridicule. And so, it's not necessarily something that is effective all the time, but it is effective some of the time. That's what they did to Ezra when they tried rebuilding the wall, and it worked then, right? So why put forth more effort to get rid of Nehemiah here if you can use the same old trick and get rid of him here? But I think Nehemiah has a better response here. Nehemiah could have responded to this ridicule in a few different ways. He could have just ignored it, just let it go. They're just calling us names. Just ignore them. Just don't pay them any attention. That's what we tell kids to do on the van, right? People's making fun of them or poking them or making a loud noise or something like that. Say just ignore them. They'll stop, And sometimes that is the way to do it. But I don't think Nehemiah wanted to do that here. He didn't want to start off with that tone of, hey, we'll just let them have their way and we'll keep doing our thing. He could have argued with them. He could have debated with them and caused a big scene or a big fight, but he also didn't want to give them the credit of disrupting the work and of seeming that important. And so what's he do? In verse 20 here, he has a very simple answer for him. And I think this answer was three-part that we can see here. He says, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore, we his servants will arise and build. But ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. And so the three parts of that I think we can see is the first part, he's saying that they're rebuilding the wall because it's God's work. It's what God wants them to do. And so that's their motivation. He's stating their motivation here. He's also saying that they're God's servants. The Jews are God's servants. And in saying that, he gets to the third point there at the end, saying, you all are not. These other guys that are making fun of them and trying to get them to quit, they have no part in it. They have no part in this work of God because they're not God's people. And so they need to just leave them alone, right? So very simple and to the point here on Nehemiah's part. He was very plain and very firm, I believe. And so he's effectively staged him off for now, but we'll see. That's not all the weapons that they have, right? That was just the easiest for them to use. And so coming to the end of this chapter, we're going to continue in the book of Nehemiah here over the next few months. And, here we've seen three examples of Nehemiah's faith, but we'll see more examples of Nehemiah's faith in the future lessons here. He's a man of great faith here. I think a great man for us to follow in our faith. And, these three examples, right? We said he had the faith to wait, he had the faith to ask the king, and he had the faith to ask others or to convince others. And we may not be challenged in those exact three ways, but we can certainly take example from Nehemiah here. And I think we can see that the bottom line isn't necessarily that we have to follow those three acts of faith necessarily, but we need to have the same faith in that we're willing to take the risk that Nehemiah took. He took a lot of risk for God here. He chose to stand up for God and to do what he was told and to complete the task for God. And so I like looking at Nehemiah here as an example of faith, and hopefully we can follow that example. All it took for Nehemiah to complete this task was stepping out by faith and allowing God to use him how he had planned. And so that'll finish out chapter 2 for us. Does anybody have any comments or questions or anything like that before we close? That also finishes out the first lesson in this book. We took 3 weeks for one lesson, okay? But that's okay. That's okay. One lesson in this book covers 2 chapters, so we're going to take it a little slower than that. Any comments?